In my research, I tried to map out these considerations and also try to talk about different ways, as you say, and there is a variety of ways in which states disclose intelligence. And those ways, in terms of quantity and quality and the frequency of the disclosure, they all derive from what you want to achieve and what you're willing to risk to achieve it.
This episode looks at questions pertaining to the public disclosure of intelligence. Why do states and agencies publicly disclose intelligence? How do they benefit from such practices? How is it done? And to what extent does society understand intelligence to begin with? Listen to our guest, Dr. Riemer, to find out more. Welcome to another episode of the Diplomatic Academy, The Conversation. I'm your host, Petros Petrikos. This episode puzzles with the issues of intelligence disclosure and the question of should intelligence be publicly disclosed. We will be discussing under this theme in conversation with Dr. Ofek Riemer. And hello, Dr. Riemer. It's very kind of you to join us for this episode.
Hi, Petros. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Just a few words on our guest. Dr. Ofek Riemer is an adjunct lecturer at the Department of International Relations at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the coordinator of the Israeli Forum for Intelligence Studies. He earned his PhD in October 2022 from the Hebrew University for his dissertation titled States Public Intelligence Disclosure in International Relations. He holds an MA in Diplomacy and Security and a BA in Middle Eastern Studies, both from Tel Aviv University. He has published in Contemporary Security Policy and has written commentaries for War on the Rocks and the Institute for National Security Studies. So you're a newly minted PhD holder, which is fantastic. And this gives me the opportunity to ask for you to give us a quick overview of what your work has recently concentrated on and what kind of research puzzles you're mostly interested in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So thank you again. So I study in my recently approved dissertation, I study states' public use of intelligence as a tool of foreign policy. I started writing it around 2017, 2018, when I actually encountered this peculiar phenomenon in Israel. And as a former intelligence officer, it was especially puzzling to see such an abundance of publicly shared information. You could see back then a lot of information on secret military capabilities, on secret covert operations, the acknowledgement of secret operations, and also the release of intelligence information and assessments. And when Netanyahu, if you can recall, revealed what came to be known as the Iranian nuclear archive in 2018. Already at that point, I realized that what's especially interesting is the disclosure of intelligence. It's puzzling, it's counterintuitive, and that was what attracted my attention. But as I started reading about it, I discovered very quickly that much scholarly attention was given to publicization of intelligence as politicization of intelligence. So basically taking this fundamentally critical, skeptical view of this practice, especially in light of the 2003 farce in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq. If you remember when American and British intelligence agencies, governments disclosed, practically distorted, dubious information on Iraq's WMD program and ambitions. And I was interested in intelligence disclosure for strategic purposes, not just to influence domestic audiences, but also to influence international actors, mainly international actors. My dissertation was actually comprised of 3 focus studies. I started with the reasons. Why do we see states using more and more, resorting to this practice of publicizing intelligence? Then I was specifically interested in the use of intelligence as a tool of coercion. So along with my supervisor, Dr. Daniel Sobelman, we conceptualized the use of intelligence as a coercive measure. And lastly, I had another study that asked how it affects society and how it is perceived by domestic audiences. So this is a brief overview of the dissertation.
Well, that's very good to hear, and it's good to know that you also have a related background that, where you can reflect and see how these processes that you referred to have actually, unraveled. And which brings me to my first question on the importance of intelligence disclosure in the related practices for national security. How would you say that this practice, intelligence disclosure, relates to the wider society, and what actually makes it important in your view?
That's a very good question. I think that the campaign, this high profile public campaign in the run up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine back in February of this year, is a case in point. And it's actually a milestone, I believe, in the history of intelligence disclosures, because it epitomizes the relevance to international security and also to other. It has, of course, systemic influences. So if you recall, the West publicized intelligence on preemptively publicized intelligence on Putin's intentions and planning and some of his operations. This, of course, was not. It did not achieve everything the West perhaps hoped for, namely to prevent the war, but it did effectively, I think, countered Russian disinformation. It helped the West build a coherent meta narrative of who's the aggressor and who's the victim in this story, which, of course, the Russians tried and continue to try to obfuscate that. And this, of course, helped the West to quickly unify against Russia. And also on perhaps lesser importance, but indeed valuable, is that it also helped foil some subversion operations. For example, this false flag operation that Russia intended to carry out in eastern Ukraine as a pretext for the invasion. Well, this is also important. So I think this goes to show the importance and the effectiveness of this particular practice, especially in this day and age where much of the warfare is in the information environment, in the media. So it really helped shape the strategic and operational environment, but also the information environment. So I think that this is the first point, and you were asking also about society. So if we look again at this particular case, I was referring before to the 2003 intelligence disclosures that preceded the invasion of Iraq, and this created a trust. I mean, there was a complete crisis between trust crisis between citizens, American citizens, British citizens, and their intelligence agencies and governments. And now perhaps the fact that the intelligence here in 2022 was accurate and was timely, perhaps allows them to rehabilitate this trust. But of course, there are still this temptation and these opportunities for, again, distorting intelligence and politicizing intelligence.
It's the name of the game as well, right? I mean, how you utilize intelligence in this way as a tool, or also obviously to extract information. And as you've said, this is the information, and access to information is a major way of dealing with the modern crisis.
Yeah.
And I think I can think of another example, I guess, how other countries do this disclosure of intelligence publicly. Estonia, the case study that I'm studying for my PhD, their foreign intelligence service does that as well. They have annual reports, which are very interesting. And, in the case of Estonia, sometimes they don't really care what kind of outcome their disclosure will have. For example, it actually created a diplomatic episode with the Chinese ambassador in Estonia after they disclosed certain strategies which were unfavorable to China, which was also interesting to note. But at the end of the day, it also depends on, I would say, on the strategic culture and the identity of the ones disclosing intelligence. There's always a purpose behind it, as we've seen.
Yeah.
And given these examples that we've highlighted, I'd like you to see if we can situate this process, if you like, within history. If you have any notable examples in history where the public disclosure of intelligence is emphasized.
Yeah, sure. And I'm guessing that the example that you gave is quite a recent example, right?
Yeah, it is.
It's from recent years. Yeah, so it goes to show that really in recent years this has become a very ubiquitous way of conducting international affairs, but it's not unprecedented. In history, indeed, there were some notable intelligence disclosures that we can recollect. I think that the earliest and perhaps one of the well-known examples is the Zimmermann telegram. It was a telegram that was intercepted between the German Foreign Ministry and the German Embassy in Mexico during the First World War. And it offered, it requested, the German Foreign Ministry requested the embassy there to propose an alliance to the Mexican government against the United States. So if Mexico invaded the US, Germany will support it. And the British, it was the early days of communication and also of intercepting and deciphering secret communications. So the British were able to intercept it, and they decided they will share it with the U.S. administration. And of course, they had a great interest in that, in luring the Americans in, so to speak, to join the war and to help them tip the scales. So they secretly shared it with the Americans, and then the Americans decided to go public with it. President Wilson decided to go public in a way of persuading Congress and, of course, U.S. citizens that there is a reason to join this war. And of course, there are other examples, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and there is also perhaps a less known example, an Israeli example from the Six-Day War. On the third day of the Six-Day War, there was a telephone call between Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser and Jordanian King Hussein. And Nasser, at that time already, he knew that there was this massive Israeli air raid on his air bases. He didn't share this with King Hussein, but he did try to convince him into fabricating news that the U.S. and the U.K. have participated in the Israeli raid, which was, of course, not true. It was completely done by Israel. But so Israeli signal communication unit intercepted this call and decided that it's important to share it with the world. This lie. Indeed, it was then reported. This lie was repeated in Arab radio stations that morning. And Israel decided to disclose this telephone conversation because it feared that it will make the USSR intervene in the war, something which Israel, of course, feared. So it does have historical precedence, this practice of publicizing intelligence, but it's indeed increasing and proliferating in recent years.
Given these examples and how we've seen this, how things have changed in recent years, in what ways do you think that states, well, or have you seen in practice, how do states practically disclose intelligence to the public? And if you could highlight also some key factors for, influencing the disclosure of such information, like if there's a universal thing out there that prompts states to actually go out there and disclose intelligence.
Yeah. So in my research, I try to map out these considerations and also try to talk about different ways, as you say, and there is a variety of ways in which states disclose intelligence. And those ways, I mean, in terms of quantity and quality and the frequency of the disclosure, they all derive from what you want to achieve and what you're willing to risk to achieve it. And this is basically this disclosure dilemma that Carnegie and Carson also refer to, which basically says that the more you disclose, the greater the political and the military impact on the one hand, but also the greater the political backlash might be and the operational costs. So when a state decides to disclose intelligence, I think that the first consideration, and this is of course not surprising, would be the risk to intelligence assets. So on the one hand, there are of course open source intelligence and satellite images that are perhaps cheaper, more dispensable ways of gathering information that states will be perhaps more willing to share publicly. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have the more valuable intelligence sources that it takes a lot of time and resources and money to develop. And this is, of course, human and signal intelligence. And when we're talking about human intelligence, of course, at the end of the day, if you publicize information that was gleaned using spies and agents, you will be risking lives, so human life. So this is, of course, a serious consideration, and perhaps the main reason why, in many cases, states decide not to disclose intelligence. So, however, I think that that today, with the abundance of information that is out there that you can garner from all kinds of open sources, which are also available, commercially to and citizens themselves collecting intelligence, states perhaps have this ability to, if you tapping into decision making in secret operations and underground projects, secret projects, of course, requires intimate intelligence, the kind that mostly states have. But the fact that you have such an abundance of information that is available out there, I think that states sometimes build on perhaps intimate, more valuable intelligence, and use the kinds of satellite images, etc., to corroborate their claims. So they don't reveal the valuable information, but they use perhaps cheaper types of intelligence to corroborate their claims and make them public. The second consideration is how you're revealing it. Are you doing a partial revelation or full revelation of what you have? Is it a one-time disclosure or a repetitive disclosure? And here, of course, if you reveal your full knowledge, everything, all the evidence, the incriminating information you have on another actor, it makes a more compelling case. But it's also costly and escalatory, and you also exhaust your coercive leverage over this actor quite quickly. When you do it a full disclosure in a one-time incident. But on the other hand, if you do a partial disclosure, it might not be compelling, but it's of course less costly and it's a more calculated. You can reveal something and wait and see how your opponent reacts, and of course you can retain your leverage over this opponent and basically extort it. Yeah, and I perhaps one last consideration. Then I will give an example. So actually, an example for that would be, I think, the Turkish case. Turkish intelligence revelations on Khashoggi's murder, the assassination directed by the Saudis of this dissident, and I think it was also a Washington Post journalist, in the consulate in Istanbul in 2018. The Turks have had intimate information on how it was perpetrated, who asked for it, how it was done, but they revealed it incrementally. They didn't reveal everything they know, and I think it's important to note here that to this day they didn't reveal the actual tape. They said that they have this tape of the assassination itself. They didn't reveal it until today, because I think they didn't want to burn their bridges with the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, and but they did reveal some incriminating information encircling this smoking gun, so-called, and they did it gradually. And so the third consideration is how associated you want to be with the disclosure. On one end, there is deniability that allows you to, states can reveal information using an off-the-record conversation with reporters, using perhaps foreign media outlets. I mean, the first revelations on Khashoggi were in the New York Times, and it was an anonymous source within the Turkish government. And on the other hand, there can be attributed disclosures, which are much more performative and much more credible. You put yourself as the coercer in this case, as the one revealing information, and it has a lot more perhaps performative power before the audience. So I'll just give you one example of that, very contemporary example, which is the last week, I think that was, there were reports in the Washington Post that a U.S. ally reported to the United States that there is going to be an arms delivery from Iran to Russia of drones and cruise missiles, etc. And I think that we all know it was I think it said that the source is well informed on Iranian weapons industry. So I think that we can make an educated guess that the source was Israel, but it didn't want to attribute the disclosure to itself, because it's walking a fine line here between not aggravating Russia on one hand, and on the other hand, putting itself in the right side of history and showing that it is monitoring and providing information and assisting the Ukrainians to defend against Iranian weapons. So this is a way of perhaps about creating this balanced strategy.
So it's interesting because you've referred to how in order to actually to engage in this practical disclosure of intelligence to the public. States and agencies, what they do is they calculate, they assess the costs, whether this is a costly procedure. You've highlighted some examples as well, and we've seen with Khashoggi's case that some revelations have been only partial. So I'd like to understand a bit more about this assessment, if you like, and how do they, states, how do they assess to what extent, disclosing intelligence publicly is effective or harmful to their interest. You've already, said that they calculate to what extent it can be costly, but what sort of mechanisms do you think they have in place? And is there a balance that usually agencies opt in for? Like, how do they classify what information might be classified or secret, and then it gets declassified and can be shared with the public, or whether this is any communication with the leadership of the country? Like, obviously, it depends on each case. I mean, you can talk about the cases that because I understand that it differs from state to state.
Yeah, that's a good question. First of all, I think that states publicly use intelligence as a last resort. I don't think that this is the first course of action that comes to mind. I think that if we're talking about a military issue, perhaps a secret nuclear program or a secret WMD program, like chemical or biological weapons, or I don't know, some kind of attack. If they don't want to use force, and if they are reluctant to use force, if they lack the political will, and they fear that it might escalate into war, and on the other hand, if they have tried perhaps privately communicating the opponent and it didn't work out eventually, and it wasn't impressed, only then I think they will use intelligence publicly, hoping that it will impress their opponent, or perhaps also disrupt its plans. One of the cases I use in my research is Israel's campaign against Hezbollah's attempts to manufacture precision-guided missiles in Lebanon, inside Lebanon, which is something Israel regarded as quotes balance-breaking weapon. And in this case, Israel knew, usually, and you said we have to take the strategic culture into account here. Israel, in normal cases, would preemptively disrupt this plan, but specifically in Lebanon and in front of and confronted with Hezbollah, which is quite a conventional threat to Israel, it didn't want to operate, and it didn't want to strike within Lebanon and to destroy its facilities where it manufactures those missiles. So what it did was to incrementally, gradually disclose its intelligence on the whereabouts of Hezbollah's operations that are related to this project. And this, we know that it kind of interrupted Hezbollah, and it was forced to move from one place to another and to lose precious time here. But overall, it didn't deter it from pressing forward with this issue. So I think that this is so, as I said in the beginning, I think it's a last resort. It's not the ultimate. It's not a silver bullet, the same way it was, I think, with Russia. They try to put this intelligence out to see how it affects the other side, perhaps to tip the opponent out of its balance, but it doesn't stop a resolve actor or a determined actor from pursuing with something it considers vital for its national interest.
Is there a specific term with the Russian example, like anything in regards to experimenting with disclosure of intelligence? Like, is there a term for that specific practice?
If there's a term for what? For publicizing intelligence and
In an experimental way to see how others react, or that doesn't really exist?
so I think this is this gradual approach. I think it's what some I think Alexander George referred to as this wait and see approach, or the turning of the screw. You know, you do something and you see how it affects the opponent, whether it shapes its behavior or not. Of course, you can risk that your opponent will adapt eventually to your disclosures, which is exactly what happened with Hezbollah in the case I just mentioned. Eventually, they adapted and they understood that there is an immunity there, that there is a space that it actually, that the fact that Israel is disclosing intelligence stands for its lack of determination to use force, its lack of will to use force. So they quickly understood there is, I think, an immunity there, that they're immune to some extent. So it's a nuisance, the fact that you find a new facility and then it's burned publicly, and then you have to find a new one. But eventually, Israel will not, stop this militarily. Yeah.
Yeah. This makes me think of a couple of there's an example that I like to bring in, especially when it comes to regulation of intelligence, but also regulating to some extent the actual agency. It really depends, again, as I've said, from case to case. But I can bring in the example of Cyprus, which is another case that I'm studying, where in 2015 there was this scandal of which involved the intelligence agency. And basically the scandal was that there was a leak that revealed that the agency was essentially spying on the citizens without anyone's consent. And the issue was that the intelligence agency, from its foundation and the foundation of the Republic, it was never regulated. There was never an official mechanism. There were unofficial procedures, of course, but nothing official, nothing on paper as to how this whole agency is regulated, who gets to join, and so on. So from 2016 onwards, the parliament passed a law which basically regulated the service. And it also changed its name. The former head of the service back then resigned in 2015 after the scandal. And ever since, every now and then we've had some debates on how information of this nature is regulated, to what extent, what sort of good practices we should follow, and so on, in order to avoid, any scandals as such. And, also when scandals happen, how do we justify it? Because, very often, actually, I have a quote to share that this was shared with me by an official in Brussels who has an intelligence background, and where they said that intelligence is practically the act of conducting illegal action with the backing of your state, of your national authorities, in order to uphold national security.
Definitely.
Yes. So given all this, the scandals, the fact that, a scandal essentially means that you've done something illegal. Well, I'm putting it very bluntly here, but do you think that are there any specific good practices we could follow in order to properly regulate the disclosure of intelligence, also the work of the agencies, without, restricting their work? We still, allowing them to operate on the operational side, conduct their work as they should be doing so.
Yeah. So what you're describing in the Cyprus context is also quite similar to the Israeli context in some ways. Um, Perhaps we didn't have these scandals, this type of scandals. We did have some, of course. The use of force by the intelligence agencies and their, you know, so to speak, illegal ways of extracting information, but not the type of scandals that creates this trust issue between the intelligence services and the domestic audience and the citizens, basically. But there are types of, we can say, perhaps abuses of this monopoly over information that I think do harm or hinder democratic values and good governance, because in Israel, indeed, intelligence is regarded sacred, especially everything that is related to national security. And intelligence services and the government have a monopoly over such this type of information. And the information that does get out is mostly engineered and selective. And it serves either these strategic purposes that I covered in my research, but also some other parochial interests of the head of the intelligence organizations, or the heads of or politicians, the prime minister, and etc. And I am really advocating, and also in some of the policy papers that I have written on this, for the periodical, perhaps annual, biannual reports on intelligence assessments relating to national security. The way it happens in the US or in the UK, in the US, I think from the 90s, all the chiefs of intelligence have to appear before Congress once a year, I think, to discuss national security threats. There is an open hearing, and there is a secret hearing, closed hearing. And in the UK, they file reports that are publicly released. And in Israel, this doesn't happen. This doesn't really happen. And I think that one way of regulating it and balancing between those strategic, selective releases and on the other hand, sharing intelligence for the public good and in the service of the public's right to know, is this way, is by doing it like they do it there, to create this open discussion on intelligence assessments and national security.
Okay, you've covered a lot on the practical application, but also the reasons behind why they decided they move up with this procedures when it comes to intelligence, when it comes to the agencies, when it comes to publicly disclosing intelligence. And this is, I guess, this final question that I want to ask is a bit more academic, but if you don't mind giving us, an elaboration on what kind of tools or frameworks can we study intelligence as a concept within security studies, mostly and beyond.
Yeah. First of all, what I tried to do in my dissertation is to approach intelligence as a source and as a tool, perhaps, of state power. There used to be this discussion. I think it's pretty outdated now, whether intelligence is a source of state power or not, or it's only serving decision making. And I think that perhaps I know where I stand on this debate, if it's still alive. And I think that especially in this hyper-mediatized age, in this age of gray zone conflicts, of cyberspace conflict, intelligence and especially public use of intelligence, is a way of projecting power and influencing other actors, and being one step ahead of other actors, like in the case of Russian disinformation, for example. And I think that this is perhaps the main prism. But another prism of studying intelligence, I think is a cultural and sociological prism. Indeed, intelligence is pretty much, to a large extent, grounded in context and in national context. I mean, the way Israelis or Cypriots or Americans do intelligence and the way their public relates to intelligence are pretty much different. For example, in Israel, there is a lot of public deference and public trust in the intelligence agencies, and this allows the intelligence agencies to do all sorts of things. And I think that basically taking this prism is very helpful. The third research that I conducted tried basically to see how the public perceives this type of usage of intelligence, this public employment of intelligence as a foreign policy tool. And what I intend to do next is to see also how it affected how this growing inclination to publicize intelligence has shaped the intelligence profession and the practice itself. How intelligence professionals do intelligence in an era where their output is more likely to be publicized and shared rather than kept secret and concealed. So it's a more perhaps sociological. For example, we're educated on this secretive aura of intelligence personnel, and now much of their conduct and estimates, for example, this daily intelligence assessments publicized by the British Ministry of Defense, is something that is open for criticism as well. So it must, in my understanding, it must affect somehow how intelligence professionals experience themselves, their work, what they do. It must also affect their relationships. So I'd be personally more interested in the future to take this prism, I think, of intelligence studies.
Yeah, I like this. I like this approach. I mean, the sociological take is something that I can also relate. Though I think it could be a mixture, because you've also referred to that, the graying, the prism of the graying of information, of other practices, cyber and so on, which is a phrase that I also have seen several times when studying hybrid threats, and they're linked to intelligence, obviously with information practices and so on. So I think to some extent it's useful to use a combination of the two prisms that you've referred to, but this sociological take is something that's perhaps personally I think it's a bit more interesting in the sense that how it is perceived, how people react to this kind of thing, and then, as you've said, in turn, how the profession itself is influenced and shaped. Thank you so much for your time, and I wish you all the best with your future research. And given that it's very interesting, hopefully we can collaborate at some point.
Definitely, yeah. Thank you very much again for having me and for giving me this opportunity to talk about my research and share insights.